Right. So this has a relatively long history. I'll kind of go through the most important chapters, and then eventually, as we move on, I can go back and add further details. So this territory was never very densely occupied and also never very seriously colonized. So the first um, European power to have a significant presence there was the Netherlands, and then at some point in the late 1700s, Spain was kind of consolidating its province here in Venezuela, and it was a captaincy general, so kind of a minor province compared to others. And they kind of established with the Dutch that their easternmost boundary was the Essequibo River. And there are reportedly communications that was more or less established. Then in the early 1800s, Venezuela begins its independence struggle that involves a very long and bloody war against Spanish royalists. And once that's more or less consolidated in the early 1820s, Venezuela assumes, which is more or less natural, that it would inherit the whole territory of what was the Spanish Captaincy General of Venezuela, all the way to the Essequibo River. By then, it was no longer under the control of the Dutch formally, because there was the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814, whereby the Netherlands passed off, like proper colonizers, passed off the British, the Guyana to the British. And by that time, Bolivar, the independence hero here in Venezuela, sent an envoy to London to get acquainted with the new neighbors and establish that Venezuela's territory would go all the way to the Essequibo River. That was, again, according to historical documents, accepted by the British. But then as time went on, London started to become a bit more interested to find out what they had there. And they hired a German botanist and researcher to figure out the border. And as he was doing that, there were significant discoveries of gold and other minerals. I mean, the Essequibo, as much as you want to portray it, or as much as people might try to portray it differently, has always been about resources. It kind of pains me to say. And so as the British were finding more and more gold, they kept drawing a border that moved further and further to the west. And at some point in the late 1800s, there were British settlers already very deep into what is now Venezuelan territory. Never mind the Essequibo, inside Venezuelan territory in Bolivar State, in a gold mining rich area called El Callao. And of course, Venezuela protested along the way, but this was a very turbulent period of, we call them caudillos here, so different strong leaders that had their following and were fighting each other. There was a very bloody federal war in the 1860s. So anyway, it was a very weak state and not in any condition to really challenge the British territorial expansion. And so what they did, and this is very ironic, is they appealed for help from the United States, urging the United States to invoke the Monroe Doctrine and exert their influence in the hemisphere. So President at the time, if I'm not mistaken, Grover Cleveland, intervened, set up some mediation with the Brits that kind of halted the expansion, and then convinced Venezuela to go to an international arbitration. This is the famous or infamous 1899 Paris Tribunal, where Venezuela did not have any representatives. It kind of surrendered or was convinced by the U.S. that its interests would be represented. But then, and I'll come back to this in a second, this arbitration tribunal essentially handed the entire territory under dispute to the United Kingdom. Not entirely, and there was a very important part that stayed in Venezuela, which is the delta of the Orinoco River. And that's very important because it kind of spans out to the ocean. But anyway, Venezuela did not accept this ruling, after it had foolishly believed the United States would have its best interests at hand. And this was more or less how the situation stayed in the first 60 years of the 20th century. Venezuela, to more or less extent, being unhappy about the result, but not really mounting any kind of serious challenge to it. But then in the 1950s, there was a letter that was revealed by one lawyer who was involved in the process. And after he died, he left instructions that he wanted this memorandum to be released. And in this letter, he revealed that there was very significant collusion and malpractice among the 5 judges in this 1899 Paris tribunal. So that kind of gave Venezuela ammunition, quote unquote, to reopen the border issue. But there was a bigger context to that, which is not so often remembered on this side of the border, but very frequently on the other. And I think it's not something we should overlook, which is as Guyana was gearing up towards independence, there was a very significant fear from the United States that it was going to be a very progressive, left-leaning, even socialist, aligned with Cuba government to take power. And so it did a whole bunch of stuff to kind of stop, inside Guyana to kind of stop that from happening. And it also egged Venezuela on to bring up the Essequibo dispute once again. And the people who were in power here in Venezuela was Democratic Action. This is kind of a social democratic party, the most important party of this kind of US aligned period, which is the second half of the 20th century. Rómulo Betancourt and Raúl Leoni, very close to the US Democrats, very close to the Rockefellers. And so they brought this issue up in the United Nations in a kind of anti-colonial commission in 1962. This led to dialogue. And then in 1966, which is the other significant moment, which is the Geneva Agreement. The Geneva Agreement is signed by Venezuela, the United Kingdom, and still a colony or soon to be independent British Guyana. And the parties agree to find an amicable and mutually satisfactory solution to this border controversy. And then after Guyana becomes independent, a few months later, it takes over the role of the United Kingdom in dealing directly with Venezuela. And this agreement, and we can go back to this later, never really got very far because there was a significant difference in interpretation. So Venezuela said, from the moment where this instrument is out and is signed by all the parties, then the 1899 agreement is automatically nullified, and this means that we have to engage directly to find a solution. Whereas Guyana says that Venezuela never actually proved in court that the 1899 agreement, the 1899 ruling should be nullified, and so before that happens, there is nothing to discuss. And this has more or less been the stalemate since the 1970s. So the Geneva Agreement, just to fast forward, established a mixed commission that had a 4-year period to find a solution. It never really got off the ground. There was a moratorium that also didn't take very far. And the issue was more or less left forgotten. And then under Chavez, there's a new constitution in 1999. The new constitution does say quite explicitly that the Venezuelan territory is a territory inherited from Spain after independence. But Chavez never really brought up this issue. It never turned it into a significant part of his international policy. And he looked for a different approach, not just to Guyana, but to the entire Caribbean, more focused on cooperation and these programs like Petrocaribe to really provide a different kind of cooperation in the region, try and help these countries be less dependent on US corporations. It doesn't mean that the issue was dropped. I mean, Chavez would mention now and then that this was a legacy from colonialism, but it would have to be settled eventually. But there was never any kind of bellicose rhetoric. And it, as I said, the focus was much more on solidarity and cooperation. And then this changes very significantly from around 2015, because on one hand, Guyana, there were always suspicions of these significant offshore oil deposits, and Guyana kind of moved to explore them with ExxonMobil. And then in 2015, there were these massive discoveries, and that's when the issue kind of comes back to the fore. There's this kind of it's called the good offices of the Secretary General of the United Nations that didn't really reach any conclusion, and then the UN Secretary General handed the matter or refer the matter to the International Court of Justice. Venezuela did not accept this, said he was exceeding his capabilities. And in early 2018, Guyana filed a lawsuit before the International Court of Justice to uphold the 1899 border and kind of be done with this once and for all. And fast forward to the present in September, and I apologize if this has gone on a bit too long. In September, what the new flashpoint was that Guyana awarded new licenses to exploit these offshore oil deposits. And one thing that's significant is that the maritime border has never been settled. And in 2011, Guyana went to the relevant UN commission to try and extend its maritime border, so essentially move the angle of the line. And Venezuela did not accept this because, this has to be settled between the two countries. But what's significant is that some of these licenses that Guyana wanted to issue recently involves territory that is between, let's say, the Venezuelan line and the Venezuelan version of the line or the Venezuelan version of the line and the Guyana version of the line. So they may actually be in Venezuelan waters. So anyway, this led to a whole frenzy here that culminated in this December 3 referendum that had kind of overwhelming support for the Venezuelan position that this territory rightfully belongs to Venezuela. We can discuss the referendum in more detail, what it means and what it doesn't, but that's more or less the summary I would make of the history. Yeah, not so much on perspective, but perhaps more on approach. It kind of depends on whether they are in power or they are in opposition, whether there's something that they want to challenge the government with. So, for example, the Venezuelan opposition, the right-wing opposition that has been, trying all sorts of ways to get back into power over the past 25 years with little success, challenged Chavez for not taking a hardline stance towards this territorial claim and favoring this more kind of amicable cooperation perspective. Now, when we fast forward to the present, it's not that the roles have flipped completely, but the Maduro government, it also responds to the internal political dynamics, trying, we have an election here next year, and trying to take ownership of an issue that's pretty much accepted across society. This is something that's very, and for me as a non-Venezuelan who has been here on the ground, but still, I didn't grow up here. And people here have it drilled to them that, the Essequibo is Venezuelan, it was stolen from Venezuela. So they have a very passionate feeling about this, which, of course, we shouldn't try to explain passion, but it is what it is. So in the case of the Venezuelan government, it's not just a matter of, fortifying its negotiating position in these kinds of international realms. It's also about, bringing up an issue that's more or less supported across society and trying to make it its own in the run-up to the presidential election, and also puts the opposition in a very difficult quandary because they, on one hand, want to oppose everything the government does, but on the other, they want to support this claim. So they are left in a kind of a very difficult balancing act, and the government, quite successfully, I could say, has managed to capitalize on that. I wouldn't say that the masses are engaged. It's not like this is the number one issue. It became the number one issue when there was this campaign and there was nothing else to be discussed. And basically all state institutions or even social movements were either voluntarily or because of the way the tide pushed them, forced to, discuss the Essequibo and present the Essequibo all the time and do workshops and rallies and all of that. But, it's not something, going back to the referendum had kind of helped fuel a bit the tensions and also the misunderstandings, but it doesn't exactly change the reality on the ground. And in fact, there was a kind of an argument against the referendum, which said that, you're already, someone talking to the government saying, you're already forced by the constitution to uphold Venezuelan sovereignty. So why do you need the referendum? And the government responded that, we want, for the first time in the 200 years that this dispute has been on, we want to consult the people, which is also a valid point, but it ties back to trying to take ownership of this issue and trying to turn it into a perhaps a campaign subject. That being said, the political scenarios here in Venezuela tend to change very quickly. So it might very well be that we stop hearing about the Essequibo for a few months until April, which is a kind of a deadline for Venezuela to present its defense at the ICJ, and then it gets brought back closer to the election. Right now, there was a very welcome development, which was this direct bilateral meeting between Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and Guyanese President Irfan Ali, with mediation from the Caribbean community and also from CELAC. They met in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and they issued, in my mind, a very positive statement, committing to not resorting or even threatening the use of force to approach this controversy, pledging to again continue to meet, and they'll meet again within 3 months in Brazil. So this has managed to lower tension significantly. In a way, it has given the Venezuelan government what it was looking for, which was kind of a recognition that this issue exists. So, by talking directly to Guyana, there is, by definition, almost something to talk about. And so the Venezuelan government can present a victory for now and perhaps hold this until the next occasion comes about. Here, the obvious answer is no. It doesn't have any, never really has. So one of the reasons why there wasn't much of an obstacle for the United Kingdom to kind of expand its territory and its settlements further and further to the west was that after independence, Venezuela didn't really establish a presence in the Essequibo. It didn't establish at all a presence in the Essequibo. It goes back to what I was mentioning before, that this was a very difficult time with lots of inner fighting and so on, a very weak state, a very weak armed force, and also the Essequibo is a very kind of jungle terrain. It's not really the most hospitable for them to establish themselves. But all of this to say that there aren't significant, let's say, Venezuelan connections to the inhabitants of the Essequibo. At least, I mean, we can separate. The original inhabitants of the Essequibo, the kind of indigenous communities, and then of course the Afro-Guyanese and the Indo-Guyanese also naturally expand into what has, for all intents and purposes, been Guyanese territory. I mean, some of the indigenous groups that are in the Essequibo are also across the border in Venezuela. I mean, for them, these borders are artificial. They don't really mean anything, but they don't have a sense of being Venezuelan in any way. And in my mind, it's very, very disappointing that in this most recent episode where the Essequibo became kind of the #1 issue in the country, there was never a significant effort to take into account the inhabitants of the Essequibo, even talk to them, reach out to them. So it's a very bad look for, let's say, the destiny of a territory to be decided without the voice of those who are presently there. Regardless of what happened, going back to the Dutch and the Spanish and the English and the Venezuelans, they are there and they need to be accounted for. There was, this is just a very small capsule, in 2005. Something that's kind of been lost in history. A group in the Essequibo filed a motion before the Venezuelan Supreme Court, asking Venezuela to, exercise its sovereignty over the Essequibo. I mean, this was a time when the economy was really prospering in Venezuela, and it was natural for them to kind of open this possibility, but it never got very far. It was kind of lost in the archives, and I was surprised that the Venezuelan government did not bring it up most recently. But yeah, to summarize, there isn't unfortunately a connection to the inhabitants of the Essequibo, and perhaps more unfortunately, there isn't more of an effort to make this connection. Just complement a couple of things. Actually, there's another historical episode that we could bring up. During this 4-year period of the mixed commission of the Geneva Agreement, between 1966 and 1970, there was actually an uprising in the Essequibo. There was an issue of revolving land, because I I only know this. I mean, someone from Guyana will explain this much better. But as far as I understand, the new Guyanese government, the independent government, did not recognize the indigenous tenancy of land, and so the Afro-Guyanese started to move into the territory, and the indigenous communities weren't pleased about that. And so there was an armed insurrection, kind of an independentist movement, who actually appealed for help from the Venezuelan government, and there was a summit between the two foreign ministries, and Venezuela essentially did not get involved. But in practical terms, the first part of the question, the claim does not have any impact on the population. In fact, if this was not in the age of social media, the Essequibo inhabitants might not even be aware that there was a challenge to the kind of Guyanese administration of the territory. And to the second part, there's been next to no effort to kind of center the Essequibo inhabitants. I mean, after the referendum, the Venezuelan government kind of jumped into action and created state institutions, created a section of the armed forces, created a civil registry, and other things. But they're all 100 kilometers deep into Venezuelan territory, so they're not really they're more symbolic at this point. They're not really in a position to actually provide any benefit to the inhabitants of the Essequibo. I mean, of course, we should, without any arrogance, recall that Guyana still is a very poor country, and this recent oil boom, which has led to very significant economic growth, doesn't necessarily materialize immediately into improved living conditions for the entire population. It's been very unequally distributed, first and foremost because of the nature of the arrangements whereby foreign corporations get the biggest by far chunk of the pie. So again, I think it is on both sides to actually center the interests of this population first and foremost, but that's really not what we've seen so far. It's a very good question, because there's the issue of the political aspect, the political cost. I mean, talking about Venezuela to begin with. So, for example, here in the recent past, you've seen this entire campaign and the referendum essentially on the line that the Essequibo belongs to Venezuela. So now, I hope everyone hopes that there's a compromise. But now, if you reach a compromise, how do you present it? How do you sell it? It's definitely tricky. I haven't seen any kind of pragmatic positions of what this solution might look like. Of course, because both sides want to kind of enforce this hardline position that there is on one hand nothing to negotiate, and on the other everything is up for negotiation. One thing that I believe is kind of a near-term possibility for progress would be fixing this maritime border. So fixing what part of this Starbrook block that has the oil and natural gas reserves, what part belongs to Venezuela, and what part belongs to Guyana. Beyond that, I don't know. I do hope that as time goes on and tensions kind of subside, that there are perhaps cooler heads to find a solution that is acceptable. We shouldn't. I mean, as much as we can highlight how this was territory inherited by Venezuela, and the British essentially stole it, it's still 2/3 or more than 2/3 of Guyanese territory. I mean, it's not reasonable. I mean, I'm not going to say if it's fair or not, because I mean that's up for other instances to decide. But it's not reasonable to just expect to claim this entire territory, and it would never be kind of an agreed to solution. Actually, if I may just make a quick diversion, the fifth question of the Venezuelan referendum, which was the most controversial one, asked voters whether they supported the creation of a new state called Guyana Essequibo, that's the Spanish name for it, in this territory, with social programs, institutions, nationality for its inhabitants, in accordance to the Geneva Agreement and international law. And I mean, this is a bit of a contradiction, because how are you going to create a new state in accordance to the Geneva Agreement? Is it a new state that only spends whatever territory is then negotiated? It's not clear at all. But of course, as I say, this referendum was not a prelude to action. It was more kind of a rallying support here on the domestic front. That being said, if we can go a bit more into the wishful thinking realm, it's clear that during the Chavez years, there was a more kind of appropriate climate to solve this issue. And perhaps there could have been more of a groundwork by the two nations to kind of establish what this future settlement could look like. And here, what I have in mind, the issue is that at the time, there was no idea that there were these massive resources there. And what I have in mind is on one hand, Petrocaribe, which was a program set up by Venezuela to supply crude and fuel, but essentially crude, to Caribbean nations on favorable terms, also boosting trade. For example, Guyana would export rice to Venezuela. So on one hand, having this perspective that resources can be used for the kind of a more independent sovereign development of Guyana first and foremost, but then of the entire Caribbean region. And also using as a blueprint Venezuela's model of dealing with foreign corporations. So during the Chavez years, and this is one of the main reasons why there was so much, and there is still so much hostility from the United States, was how the tables were turned in terms of dealing with foreign energy corporations. So legislation demands that state oil company PDVSA always hold a majority stake in joint projects, that it operate the oil fields. Royalties are extremely high. Income tax, corporate taxes are also extremely high. So having this blueprint with some kind of joint agreement for resource exploration, which would have brought some benefit to Venezuela, and it would have allowed Guyana to have a much better deal than it's currently getting from ExxonMobil. Of course, there's still involvement with foreign corporations, but under this subordinate position, which has slightly changed in recent years. I mean, as a result of sanctions and so on, that's a whole different discussion. But anyway, that's kind of a wishful thinking from my part. It's not really on the table right now, but I certainly hope that with the mediation from other Caribbean countries, also from CELAC and from Brazil, there can be some effort to kind of place the region's interests first and foremost. What's the solution that's going to favor the region, and kind of push away these threats of U.S. involvement, even establishment of U.S. military bases. I mean, there are dangerous developments like these joint military exercises with the Southern Command in the Caribbean, which is something to keep in mind. And so my hope, or our hope here as leftists, as internationalists, is that the solution will prioritize the interests of the region, prioritize the interests of the Essequibo inhabitants, and not just fall into this very nationalistic logic of what belongs to me and what doesn't.